Our speaker tonight is John Marshall. He's a natural resources scientist and researcher, and his area of interest and now, after doing all the work, expertise, is on what happens after a wildfire, not just short term, but long term. And so here to explain to us some of the changes, challenges, and interesting information that we all need to understand, particularly with more fires because of climate change. What happens afterwards? John.
Thank you, Harry. And thanks for coming and listening to what I have to say and my pictures. First off, I should probably say I'm more of a supporter of scientists than I am a researcher. I work a lot with the research side of the Forest Service, and I work with Washington Department of Natural Resources, assisting them in monitoring changes in our forests up in Washington. Um, you might ask me, want to know why I got interested in this. My father um, did Birds of Oregon, a general reference. So I was introduced to the natural world at a very young age. And one of the things that upset my father was the all-out suppression of forest fires by the Forest Service, which has come around to bite us and cause a great deal of problems. But I became aware that of the um, relevance of forest fires to wildlife habitats when I was very, very young. Um, I got to be a graduate student, University of Idaho. I was really interested in fire ecology, took courses in it. And then I got to see my first really big wildfires, which was in 1994. And a lot of what I was seeing didn't match well at all with what I'd been taught in school. And really, what was going on, partly they had some things wrong, and partly there was a huge shift in fire in how fires were behaving. This was in the early 1990s, and that trend has only continued. Um, uh, these wildfires are really going to change our natural landscapes, not only our forests, but our shrub steppe, our sagebrush country. And I'm not going to get into the sagebrush tonight, but it's a big deal there too. And basically, um, there's no avoiding fire. There's only putting it off, delaying it. We can also do some things with our forests that blunt the impact of fire when we get it, but we're not going to be able to avoid it. Um, so 1994, as I say, was the year that I first really started looking into it. And what I wanted to do was to create a set of photographs to follow through time. And this was my idea. The Forest Service signed on after I got started with it. And it's been kind of an off and on partner for 30 years now. With this year, they funded fully what I wanted to do, but there were some years there was no money at all. Um, they're they're kind of a hollowed out agency. They don't have the kind of robust funding that they used to have. So anyhow, yeah, I didn't accidentally punched a button, didn't I? So this is looking up Icicle Canyon. It's near Leavenworth, Washington. There people been to Leavenworth, Washington? Okay, some of you have been there. It's on the east side of the Cascades Range, so it's kind of in the where the ponderosa pines meet the grand fir and Douglas fir, and then up higher there's subalpine fir and larch. But you can see there's some variation in fire intensity, like these trees right in here. These are ponderosa pines that are all killed. Some of these will survive. I've seen ponderosas with 100% scorch come out of it. Um, And actually what I'm seeing here isn't too upsetting to me because there are green trees, patches of green trees around. This is really actually adding complexity to the ecosystem, what you see here. This is unlike some fires that I'll show you elsewhere. Um, so here we are, we're 30 years later, and here's some of these pines that are survived. Like I said, they would. Others are dead. A great deal more broadleaf trees. In this case, it'd be mostly big leaf maple. So when you think about bird habitat, and you probably associate certain birds with certain habitats, those that like deciduous trees suddenly have more opportunity than they had before the fire. This is another site. This is the Wenatchee River in Tumwater Canyon. Got some a lot of dead trees here, but look at these green patches. This is the way we want to get our wildfires. We want to get our wildfires in a way that we leave patches of green trees, and we have a range of fire severity. Like right here, I would say this was more of an underburn. This killed the trees. This just killed some of them. These are unscathed. This is what we call good fire. It's building complexity and heterogeneity where that serves a variety of creatures. And here we are 30 years later. Oops. So one of the places I followed is a small creek. This is just 12 days after a fire, and lots of times we get aquatic habitats are called sensitive areas. I think they're actually one of the least sensitive areas. They're very robust. You're going to see that. I mean, you can't disturb it much more than what you see here, but look at how it pops out of it in just 3 years. And then we had a debris flow. You know, the hillside came down, which we used to think was terrible, but we now realize that that's where a rock for future spawning gravel comes from, along with logs and other things. 20 years later, you can see that it's just totally filled in with alder trees. They're a little brown because there's a flea beetle infestation. But then we get to 2024, and you can see that there's so much canopy up above that it's now lost a lot of the leaves down below, and you can actually start to see through this stand of alder. I'll go back one. So 10 years time, you go from something like this where a bird couldn't fly through, right? To something here where the bird can fly through and can see around. Very different, very huge change in habitat. This is an aerial view of where I just showed you this series of pictures. This is actually the stream course right here. And this is a view from a drone, and where I took the pictures was right about here looking down. And if I were to have a drone picture in 1994, you wouldn't see anything but gray and black there. That's all you would see, not a single green tree. This is another site. There was so much heat, it split this 8-foot boulder. I assumed that it split as it was cooling, got heated up, and then as it was cooling down, it went apart. And gee, that button's sensitive. The reason I say that it split as it was cooling is that the white faces of the granite aren't covered in soot. So 2 years later, that's pine grass, which normally doesn't flower. but it flowers after fire. And then we've got some shiny leaf ceanothus coming in. And you can see a ponderosa pine tree right over here on the right. This, oops, boy, that thing. Um, back up here. So you can see ponderosa pine tree on the right. It was probably planted. It's getting bigger. So this is 20 years. And now this year, this is what you see. As you can see, it's kind of closing in. If you're an animal that likes to hide, it's easier to hide now, right? This is another site that's really interesting. I was actually there in 1994 when it was burning, standing next to two firefighters who were letting me stand there, even though I probably wasn't supposed to be there. But I got that picture on the left, and you can see this is what it was like a month after the fire went through. This was a dense stand of Douglas fir. Actually, very unnatural, not in character with what this land was historically. The result of putting out all fires had created this really thick stand of Douglas fir, and when it went, it all went. And let's see, this would be 16 years later. You can see some conifer trees in here, mostly lodgepole pine. A lot of the snags are down. You can see that more than half the snags are down on the ground. And then we had another fire. Same site is now come through a second fire 20 years later, and it killed all of the trees except for a few lodgepole pines up there. So what had started to grow back got killed, and there's soil sterilization in here where all of the logs that were down right here burned so hot that they sterilize the soil. And when that happens, it changes the soil structure and it removes a lot of the nutrients. And it's a very long-term impact. And what you see in 10 years later is not the robust growth that happened the first time around. You can see what a kind of a weak response the vegetation has here after that severe burning. Yeah, that's a site looking in on what it did to what had naturally grown back and what happened in this secondary fire. Not to say that everything is gloom. This is a site that's done really well. This was burning more characteristic of what happened would go on historically. Trees were scorched, but most of them survived. A ponderosa pine can actually lose most of its crown and still live. So these trees survived. They're doing just fine. This was kind of everything was erased here. We've got a lot of arrowleaf balsam root right there. Here we've got a huge bitterbrush plant. They're an important mule deer winter food. So this site's doing terrific. And taking another site where it just killed everything. This is in an area that historically probably experienced fires every 4 to 7 years, I think, was the fire return interval they determined from looking at fire scars. And it historically would have never experienced a fire like this that just killed everything. But this was the result of years and years of fire suppression. And the other factor is also the end of indigenous burning. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that concept, but in essence, the Native Americans did a tremendous amount of intentional burning to create the environment that best suited their needs. And so we're in a situation where we removed the Native Americans so they're not intentionally burning. And then we put out nearly all the wildfires, and we really changed the ecosystem and set it up for big falls like this. But even so, it's coming out of it pretty well. These trees are dead, but look at that balsam root that's thriving after the fire. In the creek in the background, there was a tremendous beaver population in the early years after the fire. They're not there anymore, but they sure were in the years after the fire. We get to 20 years later, these ponderosa pines that were planted are doing really well. And here we are 30 years later, these ponderosas are maybe 30 feet tall. And this place is doing fine. They actually did plant too many trees. They regret planting as many trees. This was forester think 30 years ago. The thinking was, if a piece of ground can grow a tree, there needs to be a tree there. We're growing the future lumber supply. And they really weren't thinking very ecologically. They ended up with too many trees, but they put a prescribed fire through here and killed most of them. Then that's a good thing. They got enough left that's really more like it should be. This is a site that experienced a pretty low intensity fire. Maybe it was burning at night, backing down the hill. The same site can burn in different ways depending on what's going on right at the moment in terms of weather, wind, relative humidity, heating by the sun, various factors. This site, a very light fire, nearly 100% survival on the larger trees, just top killed the brush. The brush comes roaring back, the grasses come roaring back. This is good fire. This is what we want. This is the kind of fire that maintained these ecosystems. 2018. Now I see a bit of a problem here. This thing. Does anybody know what that is? Any foresters here? Douglas fir dwarf mistletoe. Mistletoe isn't just a Christmas thing. It's a real thing that's a parasitic plant that grows on trees, and it causes the Douglas fir to grow branches in crazy ways. And you can imagine how that catches fire. So that's 20 years. Oops, 24 years. And it's doing good other than that mistletoe. And then we get a fire that same year. This is a second fire, and it really did a number on it. And here's what it looks like this year. And I thought that these trees were just going to go on for the rest of my lifetime and maybe my kids' lifetime, but no. And if I had to say why, I would say that really it left too much fuels on the land the first time through. The first time through it got lucky. Second time it didn't. And that mistletoe broom didn't help. The other thing is that even though some of these trees have survived fire just fine, they're getting plucked away year after year by bark beetles. This would be the western pine beetle, which likes to attack mature ponderosa pine trees. the big trees we really love to look at. It kind of targets them one by one. This is different than what you see in lodgepole pine, which is um, a different beetle that really goes after massive areas of killing trees. But anyhow, we're losing a lot of our mature ponderosas to bark beetles. The trees are more susceptible when there's drought, when there's high heat, and when there's too many neighbors. Let's think of it this way: they're all sharing water, and the more trees that are around sucking water out of the ground, the less water there is for any one tree to have. And really, that tree has too many neighbors, yeah, and that's not helping it live. So I'm going to switch topics now to talking about things over long periods of time. I've shown you what goes on in 30 years, which is a small part of a life of a forest. I'm going to get at something bigger, what goes on over larger scales of time. And I do it by replicating panoramic photographs done in the 1930s. This is the camera that took the pictures in the 1930s that I replicate today. It weighs 75 pounds, including the tripod. That thing that looks like an old roller skate key, that wound up a motor, a spring-loaded motor, and the camera actually swiveled through the exposure in order to take a 120-degree panorama. There were, I'm a little bit unsure how many cameras were made. The numbers between 6 and 10. That's all. And they were made by Leupold and Volpol in Portland, Oregon. And they used 4 or 6 exposure rolls of film. And according to the guy that wrote up about this project, they hired 20-somethings, college students, and if the distance was 4 miles or less, they were expected to pack this camera by themselves. If it was further than that, they could ask for a mule. So it wasn't a job for everyone. So these are the pictures that were taken. This one's from Mary's Peak. I'm sure everyone in the room has been to Mary's Peak. This is looking north from Mary's Peak. You can see that across the top of the picture, there's an azimuth scale. 0 degrees is north. 300 degrees is north by northwest. 60 degrees is east by northeast. They took at least 3 pictures at each site so that they had the full scope of what you could see from any particular lookout site. The purpose was not to document the land. The purpose was a tool for evaluating how well their coverage was from fire lookouts. But today, they're one of the best collections we have for understanding what landscapes were like in our national forests in the 1930s. And so they're used a lot today for research. And one of the things that is striking is just how much of this wasn't covered by trees. And I've not redone this one today. It'd be hard to come up with a day that clear again. But just look at how much of it is more of a grassland. And really, this is a leftover from Native American burning that they basically burned the whole Willamette Valley. And the fire would lap up the sides of the Coast Range and lap up the sides of the Cascades. Keeping it as a oak savanna was in their interest. And that has gradually faded away. So I'm going to kind of take you on a tour here in some of the places I've been. Um, I'm I'm going to stick with Oregon. I actually have far more pictures in Washington, but I'm going to show Oregon ones. Um, Everybody, I'm sure, has been to Mount Hood, and this is a pairing 1933 and 2015. Tom Dick Mountain. It's near Mirror Lake. There's a little short trail to Mirror Lake. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on one portion of these photographs because the whole of it's a lot to comprehend. So you can see 1933 was pretty burnt to toast. And you can see how it is filled in with a dense forest. And under a more natural system, what we would see is some patches burned out in this by now, which would create some habitat diversity and actually also some resilience against future fires. But that hasn't happened. This is a government camp right here. I'm sure most of you probably driven this road through government camp. So imagine the huckleberry picking here. I mean, my family has had a cabin there since the 1920s, and huckleberry picking was really a big part of family activities back in the day. But the opportunity just isn't there anymore because huckleberries, like full sun or open canopy, they don't like someplace that's just dark and shady. So the huckleberries aren't just something that affects us. There's a whole lot of creatures that eat huckleberries. You put out all the fires, you lose the huckleberry habitat until you get fire again, which you will. This is a different one at Mount Hood. This is a little to the east. Excuse me, I have to drink water now and then. So this is over near Clear Lake. Completely different habitat today than it was. And one of the things about Mount Hood, if you start to really read the history, you realize that area from government camp over to Timothy Lake, where Clear Lake and that is, was a huge Indian huckleberry picking area. They were coming from all different directions to go up there and pick huckleberries, and they managed the land for huckleberries with intentional fire. And one thing about it, if fires happen often enough, then the temperature of the fire isn't so extreme and the larger trees survive. And that's what they had going on there. Whoops. Zooming in. Very different environment today than it was. And, I would say that Mount Hood area to the south side of Mount Hood has never, ever been as covered in trees as it is today. Which really what it does is sets it up to take a big fall, which any year is going to happen. Columbia Gorge. This is a place called Greenleaf Peak. Cascade Locks is, let's see, there's Bonneville Dam. Cascade Locks is right about there. I'm sure a lot of you have driven the freeway through here, and when you look across the Washington side, you see some rather high peaks, rugged country. That's where this is. And look at the difference. Here you have a snag forest, basically, and now it's just completely covered in trees. This is where some logging was going on in the 30s. See those skid trails? And that's all covered over. This is a zoomed in picture. And I was telling the Washington State Parks, which owns this land here, that if only they could get rid of a whole lot of these trees, this would be splendid mountain goat habitat. Mountain goats need a long range of sight to see what's coming. They don't hide, they just stand out in plain sight. We need to see their predators, and they can't do that here. Also, there's no food here, but you remove those trees, you've got some terrific mountain goat habitat. So this is reeling back even further. This is 1867. This is at the head of the Cascades, where Cascades Locks is. Bridge of the Gods is just downstream on the Columbia. Look how burned that Oregon side of the river is in 1867. And actually, I'm going to back up a second to my own and point out that there's a lot of fire in here in the 1930s. And here's the Eagle Creek fire that happened a few years ago. Remember the kids that were messing with fireworks and everybody was so upset? Well, really, they just sort of moved it back to an earlier period in time. And what really comes down to it is there isn't any conditioned, forested, or fresh burned that is really a bad habitat. Is really what we want is the mix. Going over to Bend, probably a lot of you have been up to Lava Butte. You've certainly driven by Lava Butte. These are the panoramas from Lava Butte. See, this would be Highway 97 going from Bend up here down to Sun River. And look at how untreed that was. Now, this is much due to logging. Brooks Scanlon Lumber Company creamed this country. He just really stripped it. But even where they didn't, this would be a scenic corridor here, right? Look at how spread apart those trees are. There were large pines with a lot of separation. Now look at it, dense as hell. This, a fire most days would just stay on the ground and burn through it and not kill the trees. This is likely to just all go. This is kind of zooming in closer. You get a better look at what I just showed you. Okay, this is another view from up there. This is a panorama looking south to west-northwest. And you can see, again, very open here, very dense. But the really fun thing is these two trees right here, and I'm going to show you in a second. Oops. What did I do? Did I leave out a slide? I guess I did leave out a slide, but what I want to point out is that this snag, this tree that was dying in 1933, is still there as a snag. This tree is that right there, which brings up another point that in a dry forest environment, wood doesn't go away by decay. It goes away by fire. And in between fires, all you're doing is accumulating more wood to burn. Okay, so while I'm on the east side of the Cascades, I thought I'd go over to the Wallowa Mountains. How many people have hiked in the Wallowas? All right, most of you, the Eagle Cap Wilderness area. But I want to show you what's happened up there. that even though it's a wilderness where supposedly man leaves it untrammeled and doesn't have an impact, man has had an enormous impact through fire suppression. See what a beautiful parkland that was in 1936 and how filled in with trees it is now. And zooming in, this really kind of gives you a look at it. What's changed by removing fire from the equation. I mean, this is that. This is that. The other thing that's happening is these meadows are being dried up by too many trees that are sucking the water out of the ground and dropping the water table. But in terms of habitat for animals, this had far more forage than this does. And this is now set up to take a big fall. The dirty secret is that whether it's national parks or Forest Service wilderness areas, they suppress fire. And they mainly do now because they're scared to death of what that fire can do if it gets out of the park or the wilderness area. Because everywhere you go, there's homes and there's sitting ducks. The Forest Service recognizes the problem, and they've taken some very small steps to let some fires burn under some situations. This was one of them in the Wallowas in 2019. So they know they've got a problem, but how do you deal with it and get the public to go along? That's the one I wanted to show you. I got one out of sequence, didn't I? That was back at Lava Butte. That's those two trees. This guy is that guy. Imagine that still there from 1933. So sorry about that, getting that out of sequence. Okay, this is closer to Salem. This is when you're going up the San Am highway. Probably a lot of you have hiked Iron Mountain. Okay, yeah. So this is more getting into the west side moist forest. This is old growth in here, or this is old growth. This is what was a clear cut that's grown back. This was all recovered from a burn. Well, you can see this, the burn patch there. You can see that's all recovered. So this is from the top, and here we're zooming in. This is one of the few pictures that actually has a human in it. There's just a handful in the whole collection of 3,000 that actually has somebody in it. Kind of a cool hairstyle, huh? So let's talk a bit about West Side forests. For a long time, there was this thought that they rarely burned, that it would be hundreds and hundreds of years between fires. And when they burned, it killed all the trees, and then 400 years or whatever it'd go by and burn again. This was the thinking of scientists 30 years ago. There's been some challenges to that kind of thinking. A guy named Alan Tepley sampled stands and found that 73% of stands that were greater than 400 years old had at least one fire that didn't burn the stand down. And then more recently, there's been a study in the southern Willamette National Forest that found that actually fires were pretty frequent in the old growth Douglas fir hemlock zone. And a lot of them didn't burn the stand down. And a lot of them were deliberately lit by Native Americans who knew when to light them in such a way that it didn't kill the big trees. Because if they killed the big trees, they'd have all these logs to walk over. They didn't want to do that. And they found that in the young Douglas fir forests that they had fire return intervals of 50 to 160 years. As they got older, it was longer. So they found that fire was actually much more of a factor in these old growth Douglas fir hemlock forests than widely accepted. And when you think about it, every time you have a small fire, it resets things. So you have a different habitat. And kind of thinking about the spotted owl, recently they've embraced the idea that the spotted owl actually needs openings in the forest for places to hunt. And we thought that, kind of don't touch it was always the best thing. Another place in Willamette, Coffin Mountain. I don't know if that's familiar to anybody here. It's near Detroit Lake. Fabulous biodiversity here with these different ages, patches, snags, live trees, different sizes. Fire was very much a big factor in habitat historically. This is from Carpenter Mountain looking at Wolf Rock. Some of you may be familiar with that area. Obviously, this is the result of clear cutting, been clear cut and replanted. But when you really study the historic forest, it isn't homogeneous. These trees are a different size and age than what's around it. This is the most recent burn. Here's a patch that's different from what's around here. I can see a fire scar there. I can see a fire scar here. When you look at it, you realize that rather than being one big swath of green forest, it's actually very complex. And that complexity was a result of fires of different sizes at different times. Skipping further south, this is down on the Umpqua National Forest, a place called Red Mountain. This is kind of fun because this really sets it the period, doesn't it? This was before they even had a lookout tower. They had that, just a ladder. But look at this stand of trees in the background, and it's not super dense. This is the same background today. I'm not quite in the same position. I did this with a drone. I didn't have it quite exactly right, but this and this are a match. And look at how dense it is as opposed to what it was. And this is another picture there. Just incredible density, and that those shrubs are highly flammable. On a bad day, that will just all go. There won't be anything alive there. Oops. Further south, this is down near Ashland, a few miles from the California border. This is what we call dry forest. But look at the oak trees here, and they're gone. They get topped over, it gets too shady, and they can't make it anymore. And you can see how the landscape is just being packed with vegetation. And when it's packed like this, it's just ready to all burn. Everything goes. Talking to my friend Paul Hesberg, a Forest Service scientist, just a couple of days ago, he said we have 30 to 50% more biomass on the land, on our forests, than is sustainable. Really what nature does is it accrues biomass, and then a fire comes along and it pares it back down. It accrues biomass and it pares it back down. And by delaying fire, we've accrued this massive biomass, and now we're having a different climate, which really puts us in trouble. This is in the Siskiyou Mountains, a place called Hobson's Horn. And you can see what a big footprint fire had historically down there. I mean, about 50% of that land is not in forest. It's in shrubs and grasses and herbs. And there's been quite a bit of fire in more recent years, which has brought back some of that habitat types. Well, there we are zooming in. And here's the place on Hobson's Horn where fire did a really good thing. This is beautiful. It killed a lot of the small trees. Most of the big trees, which are sugar pines, survived. It's got an open understory. It's well prepared for the next fire. The other thing, just anecdotally, I saw a red-headed woodpecker there, which I've reported. It was a pair of them up in some snags. I didn't have binoculars, so I went, what in the heck is that? And I got home and opened my bird book, and well, there's only one thing it can be. People aren't going to believe me, but the field marks are so distinct, there's nothing else even remotely like it. I saw a pair of red-headed woodpeckers. I mean, you kind of figure that if habitats are changing, climate's changing, that things are going to be sorted out in a different way. Just as a kind of a treat, I found some of this while I was probing around. I found one patch further south that was in acres of this stuff, the Darlingtonia. So believe it or not, I climbed up and took a picture from there. This is a place called Hanging Rock, overlooking the Rogue River and the Wild Rogue Wilderness. I tied my dog to a tree because I didn't want him running up there to the top of the cliff. I didn't know what he would do. But here's Hanging Rock, the then and now. And you can see we've had a little bit of fire activity right here, but in general, we haven't had the amount of fire to maintain the biodiversity that was there in 1936. I mean, you look at this, you look at that, you can see, well, this was forested here. Now it's larger trees, but some of them are dying and falling over. And there's the wild rogue. Okay, we're getting kind of closer here to where we are now. This is in the Coast Range. A huge amount of the Coast Range simply wasn't in forest historically. And it was, a lot of it was Native American burning. You can see this was actually more of a grassland. If you're a hunter-gatherer, there's certain things you're going to get out of a grassland you're not going to get out of a forest. So you want some grassland around. And once you've got it open, you can keep it open by continuing to burn it year after year. Obviously, this was a clear cut today and is growing back. You see, this is much more amorphous today. Uh, is just kind of become an amorphous green mass, whereas this had much more of a diversity of age and size classes in forested and non-forested. This tree is was kind of mind-boggling to me that it was growing at the site of the lookout. You can see this was the concrete pier for the lookouts. It was right under where the lookout was. The lookout was, I think, torn down in 1957 or something. Anyhow, that tree is only 70 years old and it's 31 inches in diameter. Where I live, that would be a tree several hundred years old. So this is a place called Notai, and it's west of Eugene. And this speaks to the idea of fire that's not stand replacing. This is what we would call mixed severity fire. Kills some, believes some. And this is just fabulous for wildlife when you get that. You still got trees, but you got open space for shrubs and grasses and leafy plants. Good sight distance for animals that need to see. This has been industrialized. It's been turned into a planet, grow it for 40 years, cut it down, and do it again kind of a scenario. Yeah, so nature's model on the left, the industrial model on the right. And I think there's some concerns whether the industrial model is going to be sustainable with climate change. So one more, this is Cannibal Mountain. It's near Waldport. It's all burned in the 30s. A lot of hardwoods. I don't know whether this is big leaf maple or alder, but you can see huge deciduous component. We've still got some deciduous trees today, but not much compared to what we had. So if you think that deciduous trees are important for some species, they've not got much compared to what they did have. And of course, in industrial forestry, we just spray the deciduous because we don't want it. But that's cutting out opportunity for a lot of things. So kind of shifting, we're now getting high severity wildfire on a massive scale, where it's not helpful to the environment because it's not leaving this patterning that I've been showing you of, green patches. It's just all gone, all dead. And what's going to replace it is even age forest, if it becomes forest at all. And so besides the loss of habitat to wildlife, there's a huge amount of greenhouse gases that are going off in these big fires. And basically, we're just very poorly situated for what's coming down on us. So one of the things that I want to see is actually more logging, but with a very different mindset than what has gone on in the past. I'm not favorable to large clear cuts, maybe real small ones, an acre or two are fine, but mostly I'd like to see kind of a take some, leave some approach that opens up the forest but makes them less dense. This is some BLM land. The orange here are trees to leave. So they're actually leaving the larger trees, which is turning things upside down from what they used to do. Oops. So what can we do to be ready for this climate change onslaught so that we don't just lose these large swaths of forest? Well, we need to reduce forest density. We need to reduce the most flammable fuels, which we can do with prescribed fire or pile burning. We need to create open spaces. If you think about it, fire begets fire, heat begets heat. If you can create some openings, then you turn down the temperature and you may be able to stop a fire from continuing. We need to diversify by age and species. Do uneven age forests instead of even age. In a lot of places, we don't have a good mix of trees of the right species because we've exploded fire. We have a lot of times we have species that don't tolerate fire that have expanded, and we need to change that. Under some circumstances, best thing we can do is let wildfires burn. Other times we need to put them out immediately. And we need to be doing a ton more prescribed burning. This kind of shows how things play out, managed, not managed. This side, they'd done thinning and they had done a prescribed burn. This side, nothing. And you can see at the edge, this is scorched. You get out here and the fire just dropped down to the ground and became very tame. That's the bootleg fire, and that's down near Sycan Marsh. This is an example of a thinning project in the Colville National Forest. And a lot of people wouldn't like the result at the bottom, but in a couple of years, there's going to be much more in the way of understory plants than there is in this picture. And hey, it's going to survive. Whereas the before picture would likely take it all out. Yeah. That's scorch. Okay, he's asking about the orange color, and that's just scorched needles. And a lot of those trees will make it, or some of them anyhow. If it's got this much green on it, it's probably going to make it right here. But maybe even some of those. So yeah, that's scorched needles. Yes. Nature Conservancy properties out here. She said that there's a Nature Conservancy property there, and yes, this background over here is Nature Conservancy. Yes. Yes. So some of the things that we've done to protect the environment are not playing out the way that we would like. Basically, in the late 60s and 70s, a lot of legislation was passed, and it's affecting management today. One of them is National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which requires study before any kind of action. And the problem with it is that inaction gets a pass on if you prefer inaction, you don't have to do anything to prove your case. If you do action, you have to prove your case. And what if you don't have the money to generate all those reports? And at the time, the Forest Service, a lot of the federal agencies were pretty robust. They're not anymore. And so to generate all the NEPA reports takes a significant amount of their time, and it really slows down what they're able to do when we know that inaction is going to be a disaster. Endangered Species Act, it puts the focus on individual species instead of ecosystems. Clean Air Act, well, I'm glad it cuts down on industrial pollution, but unfortunately, any kind of intentional burning in forests is thrown in the same bin with industrial burning, and it greatly limits the ability of agencies like the Forest Service to do prescribed fire because they can't exceed these limits any more than a few times a year. So it's very short-sighted because it's going to burn anyhow. And when it burns in a wildfire, it's going to put out more smoke than it would if it was a prescribed burn. So, we've got some problems. And one of the things that I fear is, I'm not happy about the election. I'm probably not supposed to talk about that. I'm not happy. But I think that the reaction to the election could be anything that's done by an agency under the new administration is going to be highly suspect, and people are going to say, hell no, when actually a lot of things do need to be done, and there's a lot of things that have been planned for a long time. I'm going to end on a happy note here. Only if we could be a kid again and not have to worry about all this stuff. So some acknowledgements. Okanagan Wenatchee National Forest has been a sponsor for 30 years off and on. Pacific Northwest Research Station, Forest Service. So I want to say in particular, this name right here, he's been kind of a mentor to me. Paul's a research scientist with the Forest Service. He's renowned on an international scale. And he's given me a huge amount of his time. We like to paddle canoes together, and I'll read something or observe something, and he'll help me understand, put it in perspective. He's had about 100 graduate students, and I've kind of been like a graduate student for 20 years under him. Never got a PhD, but I've learned a lot. Also, I should point out, Forest Bridges is an organization in Roseburg that's trying to make some peace between the industrial forestry interests and the people who just love forests. Willow Resources in Northeast Oregon, same thing. Icicle Fund, that's Bullet family fortune that has done a lot of good projects up in Washington. Washington DNR is probably my biggest source of employment now. I've also been had some work sponsored by the Columbia Gorge National Recreation Area. So there's been a lot of organizations and a lot of people over time that have helped to give me opportunities both to go out and document and see these things and to educate me. And this has been going on 30 years.